By now, we should be familiar with the idea that the theurgist, much like the Platonic philosopher, uses and is in turn used by Eros in his or her ascent to the noetic realm in order to contemplate the one, the good, or noetic beauty. Much has been written about Socrates' dialogue with Diotima, who introduces the daemon Eros and its role in philosophical ascent. Eros lies behind everything we desire, and impels within and without us a movement that seeks integration of things the soul deems that it is lacking. We desire because we feel a void, a deficiency, an apartness that our minds and our bodies seek to fill. We desire wholeness, we desire totality. There are many great dangers in the pursuit of theurgy, but one of the most common is ego inflation, which is why piety and humility and a general emptying of the self, as much as humanly possible, are necessary before attempting any sort of theurgic contact with the divine. This video will attempt to delve esoterically into two mythoi, the first illustrating the profane attempts at achieving totality and immortality through the political sphere in the story of Gyges and King Candaules, and the second, the more successful in my opinion, but no less destructive myth of Actaeon and Diana. In 1844, the Romantic French poet, writer, and literary critic Théophile Gautier published a short story entitled King Candaules. His story faithfully records the ancient myth of Gyges, which is mentioned not only in Herodotus, but most notably in Plato's Republic, Book 2. Gautier's version is beautifully written, and the prose is bejeweled with colorful descriptions, evoking a lush and opulently exotic picture of the Orient. It is remarkably dense and aesthetic, very appropriate for a writer who lived in the transitional period just before the symbolist and decadent movements. And like the artists who embraced decadence and symbolism, there is an undercurrent of depravity and immorality that lingers throughout the story, leaving the reader with a sense of unease and injustice after reading the story itself. Gautier was no mere dabbler in the supernatural and fantastical. In fact, many of his other stories convey a deeply erudite and profound thinker regarding psychological, philosophical, and mystical matters. So what is the meaning behind this story? Let us first begin with a retelling of it. Gyges was the son of Dasculus and became the bodyguard and personal confidant of Candaules, the king of Lydia in the 7th century BCE. Candaules had an overwhelming obsession and marked pride in the beauty of his wife, Queen Nicaea. The king could not sit with the feeling that he was the only one in the world who was granted special privileged access to his wife's transcendent beauty. No one else was permitted to see her in her full natural nakedness, and this sense of contemplation in private solitude was unbearable to him. So one day he asked Gyges to conceal himself away and to view his wife naked as she undressed for bed. Gyges, deeply aware of the breach of custom and law that this entailed, this breach of privacy and sanctity of the bedroom chamber, at first refused, but was soon convinced by the king to agree. At night, he gazed upon her naked form, but was caught in the act. In the recounting by Herodotus, the queen says, for, quote, seeing what you should not see, Gyges must either kill the king, or she would order him to be killed himself. The story by Théophile Gautier imaginatively reconstructs the dialogue between Gyges and Queen Nicaea. Addressing him, she says, "Do not lie. Seek no vain subterfuges. Have at least the dignity and courage of your crime. I know all. I saw you. Not a word of excuse. I would not to listen to it. Candaules himself conceals you behind a door. Is it not so the thing happened? And you fancy doubtless that it is all over? Unhappily, I am not a Greek woman, pliant to the whims of artists and voluptuaries. Nicaea will not serve for anyone's toy. There are now 2 men, one of whom is a man too much upon the earth. He must disappear from it. Unless he dies, I cannot live. It will be either you or Candaules. I leave you master of the choice. Kill him, avenge me, and win by that murder both my hand and the throne of Lydia. or else shall a prompt death henceforth prevent you from beholding through a cowardly complacence what you have not the right to look upon. He who commanded is more culpable than he who has only obeyed, and moreover, should you become my husband, no one will have ever seen me without having the right to do so. But make your decision at once, for 2 of those 4 eyes in which my nudity has reflected itself must before this very evening be forever extinguished." Gyges, inflamed by the beauty of the queen, and also fearing his own death, chose regicide. After he murders Candaules, he is soon hailed as the new king of Lydia. Later it is seen that the Delphic oracle validates and sanctifies his ascension to the throne, on the condition that the 5th generation of his descendants will see the end of his lineage and collapse of his empire. The story of Gyges and King Candaules is in fact so ancient that it served as one of the prominent legends written by Herodotus in his work The Histories. The name of Gyges was, however, known prior to Herodotus and was commonly understood by Greeks as the archetype for the tyrannos, or the tyrant. What is so off-putting about the legend is that it seems to exhibit a moral nihilism, that one can break the laws of custom, murder the king, and supplant him, all the while being endorsed by the Delphic oracle. This was such a worrying story that hundreds of years after Herodotus, Plato took up the dialogue in Book 2 of the Republic, where he sets Socrates in conversation with his older brother Glaucon. Glaucon is a man who is deeply honest with himself and his own personal motivations, especially the darker aspects. He distinctly feels the tendency in his nature towards injustice, if only he could get away with it. He agrees with the assertions of Thrasymachus in Book 1 of the Republic that, quote, "Injustice, when on a sufficient scale, has more strength and freedom and mastery than justice." This view suggests that it is only fear of punishment that keeps a man in conformity with the law. But if given the opportunity to transgress the law, without the risk of being caught, most people would in fact prefer to be unjust in order to gain power. In order to prove this view, Glaucon relates the story of the Ring of Gyges. When Gyges was a shepherd in the service of the king of Lydia, there was a great storm, and an earthquake made an opening in the earth at the place where he was feeding his flock. Amazed at the sight, he descended into the opening, where among other marvels he saw a dead body of stature, as appeared to him more than human, and having nothing on but a gold ring. This he took from the finger of the dead, and reascended. Later he chanced to turn the collet of the ring inside his hand, when instantly he became invisible to the rest of the company, and they began to speak of him as if he were no longer present. He was astonished at this, and again touching the ring, he turned the collet outwards and reappeared. He made several trials of the ring, and always with the same result. When he turned the collet inwards, he became invisible. When outwards, he reappeared. The other shepherds sent him to make an annual report to the king, but as soon as he arrived, he seduced the queen, and with her help conspired against the king, slew him, and took the kingdom. As opposed to a ritual catabasis that seeks to descend to the underworld to receive the gifts of the chthonic gods, whether in search of healing or wisdom or both, Gyges' descent through a gaping hole in the earth uncovers a Trojan horse-like figure, a large human corpse, and a magical ring of invisibility. This is a strange inversion or perversion of the catabasis, because what we uncover is only a biological organism whose life has ended, suggesting that it is only materiality that remains after death, and nothing transcendent or salvific. Echoes of this notion can be found in Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot, where Prince Mishkin is confronted by a famous painting by Holbein called Dead Christ, which is owned by the malefic character of Rogozhin. And in horror, Prince Mishkin cries out, "Why, a man's faith might be ruined by looking at that picture." This picture of Christ depicts a corpse, with no intimations of the divine at all. In the cavern, Gyges discovers the ring suggests that the true realization found in the underworld is that all that remains for mortal humans is the grasping of power and domination in the here and now, an exertion of one's will against all others, and the application of one's insatiable desires upon the world at large. There is no afterlife. There is no reward for just behavior or punishment for unjust behavior. When you have a ring of invisibility, Glaucon argues, you can impose your own nomos, or your own laws, upon the rest of the world. Furthermore, you can then blur the boundaries between the private and the public realms, or specifically the inner and the outer realm, or appearance and essence. This hubris amounts to a tyrannical imposition that seeks to apply one particular law for the individual across the board to absolutely everyone. Pindar had a famous saying that, quote, "Nomos is the king of all." The scholars Adluri and Lenz suggest that the meaning of the statement is that all people hold their own nomoi to be the most beautiful. And through abiding by the law and imposed commands of King Candaules to view his wife's nudity, Gyges is viewing the, quote, "secret beautiful things," the kala, and is therefore transgressing the law. Later, we will explore through Proclus this idea of beauty revealing itself and wanting to be revealed. Clearly, King Candaules is enamored with his wife's beauty, perhaps similarly viewed in the Platonic lens as the eidos, or forms of the intelligible realm, and he seeks to reveal her essence to others, in this case to his bodyguard Gyges. But what the king fails to realize is that the Eros that has possessed him is of a deeply personal and subjective nature. The experience of that Eros is for him alone. It is not something to be shared with the outside, nor is it something that other people may even similarly appreciate. What King Candaules is essentially doing is assuming that for anyone to truly experience the beautiful essence of his wife, they must do so through vision alone, since words and speech are insufficient. There is an insistence that what Candaules experiences, so must others, even if it ought to remain private and exclusive, as dictated by custom and law. Adluri and Lenz realize that through his royal command for Gyges to transgress the royal law, the king is abolishing shame, and through his own desire in Eros is seeking to apply his Eros universally to the world at large. This leads us back to the histories of Herodotus. His version of the story of Gyges and King Candaules was an aid in describing the hubristic ambition of Xerxes during the Persian War. In the article entitled "The Tragedy of Law, Gyges and Herodotus and Plato," Davis sees Candaules' desire to breach the private and public realms paralleled by Xerxes' desire to impose his law on the whole world through empire expansion and conquest, to the point where King Candaules' Eros is converted into a tyrannical desire for a truly universal empire that seeks to draw no distinction or boundary between Persian law and natural law, or if you will, nomos and physis, law and nature. In an earlier video, I discussed the impossibility of total freedom, because on a psychological level, to assert one's freedom is to immediately be confronted by all the ways in which our freedoms are curtailed and limited. It is through the insistence of total independence and release from constraints that we find ourselves the most enchained. The basic psychological rule also applies to the case of tyrants, as Davis says, quote, "The tyrant sees himself as a free agent, profoundly resenting all feelings of limitation," and, quote, "To overcome the difference between himself and the world, he annihilates all distinctions between himself and the world." Furthermore, the fact that the ring of invisibility is found on a corpse is also an indication that the ring does not work as it should. It does not provide the means for salvation and completeness that Gyges seeks, and hence when he is confronted by Queen Nicaea and has to make a choice between death or kingship, she is essentially offering him an immortality based only on the empty promise that profane politics of power can promise, which is only an illusion or a false immortality. The ring is ultimately useless against the relentless procession of time. Temporal power will always dissipate in the hands of mortal creatures. Although Eros serves the theurgist as a vehicle for ascent into the noetic realm, it is also possible for that energy to be directed toward a tyranny that seeks completeness and wholeness only through the horizontal plane of political power. In this regard, it is important to realize the divine powers operate whether one acts in hubristic or profane or a pious manner. But the direction of movement and ultimate salvation of the soul are profoundly changed depending on where the energies are directed or focused. In his article, Davis also suggests that Queen Nicaea is a representative of the feminine principle, and therefore of nature or physis, which is of course the natural opponent to the tyrannizing quality of nomos, because nature within herself embraces decay and death, which spell destruction and finality to any political projects or ambitions. As we can see from the Delphic oracle's pronouncements on the future of Gyges' reign, he will only be allowed 5 generations before his empire will collapse. In Plato's telling of the myth, Gyges' profane katabasis results in a profane and pseudo-immortality, and his ultimate quest for completeness crumbles. And finally, Glaucon, who is in conversation with Socrates, also fails to direct the movement of his Eros appropriately for a real salvific transformation of himself, since he only understands the soul as a political entity that can only reach salvation through the accumulation and exercise of power. In contrast, let us look at a more theurgically productive, but no less destructive myth regarding contact with the divine, that being the myth of Actaeon and Diana, recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Actaeon was a young hunter who set off to the woods with his hunting dogs in search of a quarry. He unwittingly stumbled upon and espied the chaste goddess Diana, bathing with her nymphs in a pool of water. In her embarrassment and indignation at this unsanctioned voyeurism, she sprayed him with some water from the pool, and he quickly transformed into a stag, later to be hunted and killed by his own dogs. This certainly does not sound like a happy or satisfying ending, but of course there is a deeper esoteric reading of this work. In Mysterium Conjunctionis, Carl Jung highlights this myth in his description of the alchemical personification of opposites. He explains that Diana is also a goddess of death and destruction, and that the dog is a representative of the chthonic forces operating under her will. In alchemy, the stag carried with it connotations of self-rejuvenation. In the Sermo in Epiphania Domini by Honorius Auton, it is said, "The stag, when swallowing a poisonous snake, drinks water, quote, that he may eject the poison, and then cast his horns and his hair, and so take new," with an understanding that the horns represent pride, and the hair the worldliness and all excesses. Jung also quotes directly from the Livre des Secrets de Nature, quote, "The stag is a well-known beast, which renews itself when it feels it is growing old and weak. It goes to an anthill and digs at the foot thereof and brings forth thence a serpent, on which it tramples with its feet, and afterwards eats. It then swells up and so renews itself." It should not be surprising that we find the corrosive waters that dissolve and transform the human form of Actaeon in the myth. We can find many similarities and differences between the path of Gyges and King Candaules and that of Actaeon. Although this myth does seem like it is teaching a moral about unveiling or falling upon things we simply do not have the capacity to integrate or receive, as we view in horror the physical destruction of Actaeon, it is ultimately suggestive of the path by which the theurgist or alchemist must travel. The 16th century Italian magus Giordano Bruno wrote the Heroic Frenzies, and in his 4th dialogue, he interprets the myth of Actaeon and Diana, quote, "Actaeon represents the intellect, intent upon the capture of divine wisdom and the comprehension of the divine beauty. He unleashes the mastiffs and the greyhounds. Of these, the greyhounds are swifter and the mastiffs more powerful, for the operation of the intellect precedes the operation of the will. But the latter, in turn, is the more vigorous and efficacious, since divine goodness and beauty are more lovable than comprehensible to the human intellect. And besides, love moves and spurs the intellect to go before it like a lantern to the forests, uncultivated and lonely, very rarely visited and explored, with the result that few men have left the traces of their steps there." In this quote, Bruno is personifying the fast-moving greyhounds as the intellect that reaches out before the will, which are personifications of the mastiffs, who are much more effective at finalizing the attack, but slower moving. But ultimately, what drives the intellect forward is not the will, but love itself. For as Bruno says, quote, "Love converts and transforms into the thing loved." In this sense, quote, "the great hunter sees. He has understood as much as he can, and he himself becomes the prey. That is to say, this hunter set out for prey and became himself the prey through the operation of his intellect, whereby he converted the apprehended objects into himself. The dogs that were once Actaeans have been now taken over by the destructive dogs of Diana, and they come as forms of thoughts that no longer proceed outwards externally into the world, but are now incorporated and integrated within the ego personality of Actaeon. Bruno describes it in this way, quote, "Then he receives that he himself had become the coveted prey of his own dogs, his thoughts, because having already tracked down the divinity within himself, it was no longer necessary to hunt for it elsewhere." According to Giordano Bruno, Actaeon demonstrates heroic frenzy and shows how the destructive transformation of Actaeon dissolves his merely human aspect only to reveal the truly divine part. Quote, "Actaeon becomes the prey of his own dogs, pursued by his own thoughts, turns his feet and directs his new steps. He is renewed for a divine course, that is, with greater facility and for more efficacious inspiration toward the densest places, toward the deserts, toward the region of incomprehensible things. From the vulgar and common man he becomes rare and heroic, rare in all he does, rare in his concepts, and he leads the extraordinary life. It is there that his great and numerous dogs bring him death. Thus he stops living according to the world of folly, of sensuality, of blindness, and of illusion, and begins to live by the intellect. He lives the life of the gods. He feeds upon ambrosia and is drunk with nectar." One might naturally object, by countering that having lost his human form, he became debased as a punishment, having become an animal. After all, in the hierarchy of being, is this not a downgrade? But this is to be completely unfair toward the animal kingdom. When he becomes a stag, he descends into the most primordially instinctive source of his being. He is actually reaching the substrate of his body that is in perfect alignment with nature, the world, soul, and the cosmic movements that pervade the universe. Arguably, it is only here that true demiurgy can take place, the point where the divine and the human meet, a place where the human ego is whittled away to almost nothing that is recognizably human. The shaman, for instance, becomes the bird or the fox or the deer when they are in their trance. As Jorge Luis Borges said, "To be immortal is commonplace. Except for man, all creatures are immortal, for they are ignorant of death. What is divine, terrible, incomprehensible is to know that one is immortal." In both stories, a feminine figure in her absolute state of nakedness and vulnerability is exposed or revealed. There is a voyeuristic element to both tales, whether hiding oneself through the powers of an invisible ring or through the shelter of some foliage and shrubbery. In both instances, the law or custom is transgressed, and for that there must be a punishment. Whether in Gyges' case, through the eventual collapse and dissolution of his empire and his name, or through Actaeon, through the dissolution of the aspect that made him a common man and transformed him into something beyond human. Beauty, however, also seeks its own expression through the object or the person through which the beauty is manifesting. According to the Neoplatonist Proclus, the word for beauty, kalon, is related to the verb meaning to call, kalein or kelein, as the scholar Bayer-Valtez remarks on this association of Proclus. Quote, "Accordingly, the effect of the beautiful is to, quote, call to itself what exists and thinks, to captivate and to enchant." Even if Actaeon stumbled accidentally upon the bathing Diana, it was the power of the beautiful that led him there. This explains King Candaules' hubristic desire to show others the beauty of his wife, because beauty itself insists upon its self-revelation. He needs to display what he desires, to be viewed as possessing them. But beauty can never be possessed, and it is not his to give freely away to the voyeuristic gaze of another. Therefore, they both meet with two different types of punishment. In dealing with the gods, you are often presented with paradoxically opposed outcomes, each providing a benefit and a harm. And as a human who seeks union with the divine, there are costs and penalties for such presumption, even though the journey may prove necessary. You cannot escape unmarred from a descent to the depths or an ascent to the noetic realm. Hopefully this video has demonstrated the futility of temporal political power and the role Eros plays in tyranny on the one hand and salvific theurgic ascent and descent on the other. Take care for now.